By 1916, Europe had become a graveyard of progress. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, the Western Front was an endless scar, a lattice of trenches, dugouts, and shell holes filled with rain, rats, and the reek of decay. Men lived knee-deep in mud, sleeping beside corpses and waiting for orders that promised only death. Artillery thundered day and night, churning the soil into a ceaseless tide of filth and fire. Every offensive ended the same way. Thousands of bodies, a few hundred yards gained, then lost again. Machine guns scythed down the living like wheat. Barbed wire turned courage into futility. The commanders spoke of breakthroughs, but the men in the trenches stopped believing in miracles. The war had become a ritual attack, bleed, retreat, repeat. Letters home spoke not of glory, but of endurance. "We fight the mud as much as the enemy," one soldier wrote. Another described how time itself seemed to rot in the trenches. The front was static, but the suffering moved endlessly forward. This was the world innovation had to conquer, a place where courage had met its limit, and imagination was all that remained. Somewhere beyond the filth and exhaustion, whispers began. Engineers, scientists, and dreamers, hidden away from the front, were plotting something new, something impossible. In the choking mud of Flanders, few believed salvation could come from machines. But the war had already taught one lesson: disbelief was a luxury soldiers could no longer afford. While generals measured victory in miles and men, a different kind of battle was being fought behind closed doors, one of sketches, gears, and untested ideas. In London's secret workshops, a handful of engineers under the Landships Committee labored in obscurity. They were laughed at by the infantry and ignored by the brass. Their mission sounded absurd: to build a land-going ship, a machine that could crawl over trenches and crush barbed wire. Their creations looked monstrous, lumbering boxes of riveted steel mounted on tractor treads. Critics called them mechanical folly. Even among the Allied ranks, officers scoffed that such contraptions would break down before they even reached the front. But the engineers persisted. They had seen the stalemate and understood that human endurance alone could not outlast the machine gun. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, quietly championed their cause. He saw what others could not, that the future of warfare might lie not in bigger guns, but in mobility, protection, and shock. The engineers worked in secrecy, shrouded in naval terminology. Their prototype was called a tank, a name chosen to disguise its true purpose as a simple water container for the Middle East. As they toiled, the sound of artillery from France echoed in their imaginations. Each explosion was a reminder of the stakes. If their invention failed, the war would continue to grind men into the earth. If it succeeded, the balance of power could shift overnight. In the silence of the workshop, between hammer blows and the hum of engines, the impossible began to take shape: a weapon to break the deadlock of mud and fire. In the quiet spaces between bombardments, amid the endless mud and smoke, a few officers began to think differently. The old ways, endless shelling followed by suicidal infantry charges, had failed too many times. Every assault dissolved into carnage. But what if, someone wondered, the guns didn't stop when the soldiers went forward? What if artillery could move with them, a rolling wall of fire pushing the enemy back yard by yard? Thus was born the idea of the Creeping Barrage, not from grand theory, but from desperation and careful observation. Artillery officers noticed that enemy troops survived bombardments simply by staying low in their dugouts, emerging the moment the shelling lifted. The solution was to deny them that moment, to create a moving curtain of explosions, advancing at the pace of a walking man. It was a radical marriage of timing and courage. Infantry would follow the barrage so closely that they risked death from their own guns if they fell behind. But if the timing worked, they would emerge behind a screen of smoke and terror, finding the defenders too stunned to fight back. The first experiments were messy, costly, and uncertain. But even in failure, there was revelation. The battlefield could be controlled by rhythm and sequence, not just brute force. For the first time, commanders glimpsed the possibility of precision, of turning chaos into choreography. And in that fragile hope, amid the dust and disbelief, the language of modern warfare began to take shape. The Creeping Barrage was more than a tactic, it was mathematics brought to life. It demanded exactness in a place defined by confusion. Every gun had to fire at a specific elevation, at a specific second, advancing the barrage by precise increments, often 100 yards every 3 minutes. A single miscalculation could mean disaster. Shells falling short would obliterate the advancing men too far ahead, and the enemy would rise unscathed. So the battlefield became a living equation. Engineers and artillery officers pored over tables of range, trajectory, and wind resistance. They calculated shell arcs and fused timings with the meticulousness of astronomers. Communication runners darted between gun batteries carrying updated coordinates. The pace of advance, sometimes as slow as a crawl, sometimes a desperate sprint, had to match the rhythm of the guns. The result, when executed properly, was astonishing. From afar, it looked like a crawling storm, a rolling wall of explosions inching across no man's land. Behind it came the infantry, heads bowed, advancing into a curtain of dust and flame that shielded them like a moving fortress. For the first time, war seemed almost orchestrated. The dull chaos of battle transformed into something deliberate, almost mechanical. It was an eerie beauty, a harmony between science and slaughter. But within this new order lay a deeper realization. Intellect was beginning to dominate instinct. The men who once charged blindly into machine gun fire were now guided by geometry and timing. In the heart of destruction, logic had found its voice, and the guns began to speak in the language of precision. In the spring of 1916, on the chalky plains behind the Somme, men prepared for a kind of battle no one had ever fought before. Weeks before the assault, vast stretches of open ground were turned into rehearsal fields, miniature versions of the front, complete with flags to mark objectives and lines drawn in chalk where the creeping barrage would fall. Artillerymen practiced in mathematical unison, calculating every shell's arc, angle, and timing. Infantry officers paced the fields with stopwatches, counting the seconds between each planned lift of the barrage, the moment when the artillery would shift forward another 100 yards. The plan demanded an unthinkable level of precision across thousands of guns and tens of thousands of men. One delay, one misfire, one misunderstanding, and the rhythm would collapse. To the soldiers watching from the trenches, it felt like theater, a deadly choreography rehearsed under the grim certainty that not all would survive opening night. Yet beneath the nerves and exhaustion, there was admiration too. For the first time, many sensed that war might not only be endured but mastered. Still, no rehearsal could prepare them for what awaited them. Timing, wind, terrain, the fragile elements of control would meet the unyielding chaos of real battle. The men tightened their boots, checked their watches, and waited for the signal that would test whether human will could command the storm. Even as the generals praised the brilliance of the creeping barrage, the soldiers who would follow it could not bring themselves to believe. "No barrage could crawl," they muttered in dugouts thick with smoke and damp. Once the shells fall, the enemy rises. They always do. Many had seen too much to trust in promises of precision. They remembered earlier offensives where perfect plans dissolved in mud and screams, where artillery that was meant to clear the way instead buried their comrades alive. This new idea, walking behind a curtain of fire, seemed mad. To follow the guns so closely felt like marching into their own destruction. Rumors spread that the officers were gambling with their lives for the sake of theory. "It's easy to move lines on a map," one corporal whispered. "Harder when you're the one moving behind the shells." The skepticism ran deep, and yet orders were orders. On the eve of the Somme, as dusk crept over the trenches, the men watched the horizon pulse with the flashes of the preparatory bombardment, the sky itself trembling from the weight of human invention. They checked their watches again, though few truly believed the clocks could save them. Above the distant thunder, someone muttered, "They think they can make fire walk." The others laughed short, nervous bursts swallowed by the rumble of guns. Doubt became the soldiers' quiet companion that night. Yet beneath it lay something else, the faint, unspoken hope that perhaps, for once, the impossible might be made to obey. At dawn on July 1st, 1916, the world seemed to pause and then erupt. The air split with the roar of 1,000 guns, and the very soil of France trembled as if alive. From horizon to horizon, flashes bloomed in perfect rhythm, each one marking a new heartbeat of destruction. The creeping barrage had begun. Observers described it as something almost unnatural, an organized storm, fire advancing with mechanical precision. Shells struck in waves, the detonations merging into one rolling, endless growl. Every few minutes, the barrage crept forward, like a living curtain of flame crawling toward the enemy. Behind it, tens of thousands of soldiers emerged from their trenches, eyes fixed on the moving line of fire that promised both protection and peril. The earth before them was a seething landscape of smoke and dust, the boundaries between heaven, hell, and home erased. Yet amidst the chaos, there was an eerie order: gunners watching their watches, infantry counting their steps, officers timing each lift to the second. For the first time in the Great War, chaos moved with discipline. Fire had been taught to obey. And though the noise was unbearable, though the ground shook as if the planet itself were breaking somewhere deep inside, a new idea was being born. That science and precision, not madness, might yet find a way through the mud. Across the torn landscape, in the German lines, disbelief turned to terror. At first, they mistook the barrage for the usual preliminary bombardment, fierce, deafening, but predictable. They huddled in dugouts, muttering that the British guns would soon shift elsewhere, as they always did. But then, they didn't. The explosions didn't wander or fade. They moved methodically, relentlessly, as if guided by some invisible hand. The ground before them vanished beneath fountains of earth and smoke, and then, impossibly, the wall of fire began to advance toward them. One survivor recalled it as a living thing, a storm with purpose. Trenches collapsed. Barbed wire evaporated in sparks. Men fled upward, choking on dust, only to see the barrage as creeping closer, its rhythm unbroken, its noise swallowing their shouts. The sky was filled with the whine of shells, the hiss of hot metal, and the terrible realization that nowhere was safe. "Ease kommt näher. It's coming closer." The cry spread from trench to trench. Panic set in. Machine guns were abandoned as men stumbled through the cratered landscape, their discipline dissolved by fear of something they could not fight. For centuries, war had been about courage, timing, and aim, but now, it seemed, the very elements had turned against them. When the British infantry finally emerged from the smoke, rifles low and steady, the stunned Germans could scarcely fire. They had already been defeated not by numbers, but by rhythm, by calculation, by an idea that made the earth itself march forward. In the weeks that followed the Somme opening barrage, the creeping barrage became both an art and an obsession. Every attack was a test of time itself. Seconds were no longer mere moments, they were the difference between survival and annihilation. Officers huddled over stopwatches, their eyes flicking between synchronized watches and the smoke-wrapped horizon. Runners darted through trenches carrying last-minute adjustments, while gunners murmured mathematical prayers 50 yards every 2 minutes. Steady the angle, keep the range. The entire front became an orchestra, each unit bound by a shared rhythm of destruction and survival. Infantrymen learned to trust that rhythm as they would a heartbeat. To fall behind meant death, to move too soon meant walking into one's own barrage. Many described it as feeling tethered to the guns, the invisible thread that connected soldier to scientist, instinct to instrument. And above it all, the sound, that colossal symphony of steel, rolled on without pause. It was not chaotic anymore, it pulsed, breathed, even sang. Amidst the screams and detonations, men could sense the strange order of it, the merging of human discipline and machine precision into something terrifyingly sublime. The barrage no longer merely destroyed, it conducted. And for the first time, armies fought not as scattered regiments, but as one synchronized being, bound by calculation, courage, and the metronome of war. But mastery came with cost. For every flawless lift, every moment of perfect coordination, There were those lost to miscalculation, soldiers who stepped too soon, or gunners who fired a fraction too late. The same precision that defined victory could just as easily turn inward, consuming its own makers. Reports from the Somme and Arras spoke of friendly shells landing short, entire platoons swallowed by their own protection. It was an irony bitter enough to haunt even the proudest engineers that progress, in its infancy, could still devour those it was meant to save. The commanders debated endlessly. Was the risk worth the rhythm? Could art exist in destruction? But for those who marched behind the barrage, these were not philosophical questions, they were matters of survival and faith. The guns were their gods, and like all gods, they could bless or condemn without warning. On the German side, too, there was grim respect. They studied captured plans and wrecked positions, realizing that war had changed forever, that precision, not passion, would decide the future. The age of instinct was fading. When the barrage ceased, the silence was unbearable. Men could hear again their own breathing, the groans of the wounded, the far-off ticking of shattered watches. In that stillness, the truth settled over them like dust. Progress had not made war cleaner, only colder. The creeping barrage had turned chaos into choreography, but at the cost of innocence. The creeping barrage had shattered old certainties, but the Germans were quick to learn from it. What had once seemed like sorcery soon became a challenge to decode. Officers on the Western Front began charting the rhythm of Allied fire, timing the pauses, and listening for the subtle transitions that marked an advancing curtain of shells. Within months, countermeasures emerged. Reverse barrages, pre-calculated patterns of fire aimed not at enemy trenches, but at the gaps between them, sought to catch advancing infantry as the barrage lifted. Decoy flashes misled British spotters. Camouflage nets and false positions fooled reconnaissance balloons into targeting empty fields. The battlefield became a chessboard of deception and adaptation. German batteries began firing in irregular rhythms to confuse Allied observers. Artillerymen learned to anticipate the creeping curtain, waiting until it passed before emerging to strike back. Their defensive philosophy, fewer walls, the wall of fire, mirrored what had once terrified them. It was an evolution born of necessity, a brutal conversation between two sides who no longer saw the war as chaos, but as a contest of equations. Respect replaced mockery. Behind every counterstroke was a kind of grim acknowledgement and understanding that innovation was now the only form of survival. The front lines no longer belonged solely to bravery or blood. They belonged to minds, to measurement, to the race for adaptation amid the inferno. By 1917, war was no longer fought by generals with binoculars, but by analysts with rulers and timing charts. Artillerymen became mathematicians, surveyors became soldiers. Every round fired was logged, every pattern tested and refined. The battlefield transformed into a living laboratory, one measured in miles, maps, and milliseconds. The creeping barrage had taught armies the language of synchronization, and soon that grammar of precision expanded. New instruments, rangefinders, sound-ranging microphones, aerial photographs turned guesswork into geometry. Every contour of the land, every angle of fire, became a variable in an enormous and terrible equation. In France, teams of meteorologists calculated air pressure and wind drift to correct trajectories. In Germany, chemists perfected new propellants for greater range. The war had entered a new dimension, one of science and systems, where the human hand guided machines with mathematical certainty. But beneath the precision lay a deeper realization. Control was an illusion. Even the most perfect barrage could falter under fog, mud, or chaos. The line between order and catastrophe remained razor-thin, a reminder that for all their calculations, men still fought in the dark. As the years dragged on, the lessons of the creeping barrage rippled outward to Passchendaele, Cambrai, and beyond. Coordination between guns and infantry became doctrine, the new heartbeat of modern war. What began as an experiment in timing had redefined combat itself. The barrage had turned fire into a language, and those who learned to speak it shaped the future of warfare. The inferno had become intelligent, and humanity, for better or worse, had learned to think in explosions. The Creeping Barrage had shattered old certainties, but the Germans were quick to learn from it. What had once seemed like sorcery soon became a challenge to decode. Officers on the Western Front began charting the rhythm of Allied fire, timing the pauses, and listening for the subtle transitions that marked an advancing curtain of shells. Within months, countermeasures emerged. Reverse barrages, pre-calculated patterns of fire aimed not at enemy trenches, but at the gaps between them, sought to catch advancing infantry as the barrage lifted. Decoy flashes misled British spotters. Camouflage nets and false positions fooled reconnaissance balloons into targeting empty fields. The battlefield became a chessboard of deception and adaptation. German batteries began firing in irregular rhythms to confuse Allied observers. Artillerymen learned to anticipate the creeping curtain, waiting until it passed before emerging to strike back. Their defensive philosophy, fewer walls, the wall of fire, mirrored what had once terrified them. It was an evolution born of necessity, a brutal conversation between two sides who no longer saw the war as chaos, but as a contest of equations. Respect replaced mockery. Behind every counterstroke was a kind of grim acknowledgement and understanding that innovation was now the only form of survival. The front lines no longer belonged solely to bravery or blood. They belonged to minds, to measurement, to the race for adaptation amid the inferno. By 1917, war was no longer fought by generals with binoculars, but by analysts with rulers and timing charts. Artillerymen became mathematicians, surveyors became soldiers. Every round fired was logged, every pattern tested and refined. The battlefield transformed into a living laboratory, one measured in miles, maps, and milliseconds. The Creeping Barrage had taught armies the language of synchronization, and soon that grammar of precision expanded. New instruments, rangefinders, sound-ranging microphones, aerial photographs turned guesswork into geometry. Every contour of the land, every angle of fire, became a variable in an enormous and terrible equation. In France, teams of meteorologists calculated air pressure and wind drift to correct trajectories. In Germany, chemists perfected new propellants for greater range. The war had entered a new dimension, one of science and systems, where the human hand guided machines with mathematical certainty. But beneath the precision lay a deeper realization. Control was an illusion. Even the most perfect barrage could falter under fog, mud, or chaos. The line between order and catastrophe remained razor-thin, a reminder that for all their calculations, men still fought in the dark. As the years dragged on, the lessons of the Creeping Barrage rippled outward to Passchendaele, Cambrai, and beyond. Coordination between guns and infantry became doctrine, the new heartbeat of modern war. What began as an experiment in timing had redefined combat itself. The barrage had turned fire into a language, and those who learned to speak it shaped the future of warfare. The inferno had become intelligent, and humanity, for better or worse, had learned to think in explosions.